Hello dear students of class 10th, welcome to history class. I hope all of you are fit and healthy. Students, in this video I am going to start with a new chapter from your history book, that is chapter number 2nd, Nationalism in India. Students, in the last chapter you studied about the rise of nationalism in Europe. And in this chapter we are going to study about nationalism in India. So there is one common term, that is nationalism. So what is the meaning of nationalism? See, nationalism is very closely related to the nation. So what is this? See, nationalism is basically the feeling of love towards the nation, the feeling of connectedness, the feeling of belonging towards one's nation is called nationalism. It is basically the association of oneself with the country, with the nation. So this feeling, this intimacy with the country is called as the feeling of nationalism. Alright. So why are we studying this chapter, nationalism in India? Definitely we are born and brought up with this feeling. We love our country very much. So why are we studying this? What is the need? What is the requirement of studying? See, definitely we love our country. We have a feeling of patriotism towards the country. But you know, before independence, the Indians were subjugated by the Britishers. That means we were under the control of Britishers. We were not free. We were not independent. Everybody is born free and independent, but the Indians were not independent. Why? Because of British rule, because of the colonial rule in our country, because of which we were because of which we were ruled by the Britishers. They made the Indians their servant. So in order to get rid of the Britishers, in order to remove Britishers from our country, this feeling was very important, because unless we have that feeling of nationalism, we cannot get independence. So that is why we are going to study this chapter, that how we got independence, how this feeling of nationalism led to the independence of our country. All of you know that we got independence on 15th August 1947. Now before that, what was the situation? What was the scenario? How the Britishers ruled us? How they subjugated us? So all these things we are going to study. That means we are basically going to study about the scenario before independence and the process how we got independence. Alright. So I hope the introduction part of this chapter is clear to everybody, that what we are going to study in this chapter. See, this is not very difficult chapter. This is rather, I would say, a very important chapter, because this chapter alone carries 10 to 12 marks in your examination. So from examination point of view also, this chapter is considered very important. And let me tell you, history is all about stories. So I am sure that you people are going to enjoy this, because you will find a series of events in this story, that what happened one after another. First means there are several events. For example, when Mahatma Gandhi came to India, what he did, what satyagrah he launched, what movements he launched. So everything is serial based. There is a series of events. So I am sure that you people are going to enjoy this. So let's start with this note. So students, before I start with the first topic of this chapter, let us see that what all we are going to study in this chapter. So these are the important topics that are given in this chapter. So as I told you that how this feeling emerged in India. So this feeling of nationalism emerged in India because of these following topics. The first one is the First World War, Khilafat and non-cooperation. See, these three are very important. This is given as one, but this is not one. These are different topics that I am going to explain you one after the other. See, these are the main topics, and inside these topics there are several subtopics, alright. So, these topics are very important, they are very crucial for you to understand from history point of view also and from your examination point of view also, alright. After this, we have different strands within the movement, that means there were several movements that were launched in the country. So, for example, what was the notion of people of, cut this line. Now after this we have the next topic, that is different strands within the movement. See, there were so many movements that were launched in the country and people participated wholeheartedly in these movement. So, what was their objective, what was their notion? Because everybody participated because of their notion, because of their some objective or aim. Definitely the big aim was to get independence, to get freedom from the Britishers. But if I talk about the villagers, if I talk about the peasants, if I talk about the people in town, means everybody had different notions. So, in this topic we are going to study about the different notions, about the different strands that they had within the movement, alright. After this we are going to study about towards civil disobedience. Now, what is this civil disobedience? See, let me tell you that in this chapter basically you are going to study about two important movements, I would say three important movements. The first one is non-cooperation movement, the second one is civil disobedience movement, and the third one is Quit India movement. Quit India movement is given in a box in your book, and after we complete the chapter we will see about Quit India movement, alright. So, civil disobedience movement is also considered very important, in which you are going to study about salt satyagraha, about the participation of people, about the limitations of this movement, that why this movement was called off, how and why this movement was started by Mahatma Gandhi, what was the or what were the different notions of the people towards this movement, and what were the limitations of it, why it was called off, why it was cancelled. So, these things you are going to study in this topic. After that, you are going to study about the sense of collective belonging, and after this we will study the conclusion, we will see the conclusion, we will conclude the chapter. And after conclusion, as I told you that in your book also a small box is given regarding Quit India movement. So, after the conclusion part we are going to see about Quit India movement, alright. So, these are the broad topics that you have to study in this chapter. So, I hope the introduction part is clear, that what this chapter is all about and what we are going to study and why we are going to study. As I told you that Indians were ruled by the Britishers, we were not free, we were not independent, and we wanted independence. So, because of all that, these movements were launched, alright, and finally we got independence on 15th August 1947. Clear? So, students, with this note, let us start with this chapter, that is nationalism in India. So, as I told you, So, students, with this note, let us start with this chapter, that is nationalism in India. So, students, as I told you that nationalism is intimately connected to anti-colonialism or anti-colonial movement. Anti-colonial, see, colonial means British rule and anti means to oppose the colonial rule in our country. That means everybody was controlled by the Britishers from top to bottom, right? And each set of people or each group of people, they had different opinions, their notions for freedom were completely different from one another. So, see, since every group had different notions, for example, if I talk about the peasants, then they wanted relaxation in revenue, right? If I talk about tribals, then they wanted their rights to be protected because there were several forest laws that were imposed on the tribals, right? If I talk about the small one second. If I talk about the small mill workers, then they were exploited by the owners of the mill. So, for everybody, for each group, the notion for independence or the notion for, so for each group, the notion for independence was completely different from one another. Okay? So, how this Indian national movement got unified? See, definitely the notion for each group was completely different, but the root cause was the same for everybody. So, all the problems in the country were there only because of the British rule, only because of the colonial rule. So, this was the root cause. So, because of this, everybody got unified. That means everybody, it means the rich, the middle class, the poor. If I talk about different religions, Hindu, Muslims and several other religions, they got unified and ultimately they got freedom. Alright. So, I hope till here points are clear to everybody. So, students, you know, the Congress under Mahatma Gandhi tried to forge these groups together within one movement. So, this is basically the theme. So, Gandhiji was the strongest or the most important pillar in order to achieve independence, in order to bring every group in one strand. Alright, he was the thread in which all the pearls were attached. So, if Gandhiji, till there only. So, students, here we are going to see history after Mahatma Gandhi's arrival in India. When he arrived India, when he came to India from South Africa, he launched several movements, for example, non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience movement, Quit India movement and several others. See, these are the most important movements launched by Gandhiji. So, because of these movements, we got success at the end. Alright, so this is basically the theme of the chapter. Now, let us come to the first topic. The first topic is the First World War, Khilafat and non-cooperation. See, there are three terms. First is the First World War, then we have Khilafat and then non-cooperation. So, we will be studying one by one all the topics. Okay, so first let us come to the First World War. Now, how First World War was connected to India's freedom? Was there any relationship between the First World War and India's freedom? What was the duration of First World War? From 1914 to 1918. So, this was the duration. And who participated in the war? The war was between whom? The war was between the Britishers and the Germans. Alright, and Germans were supported by the Turkish people. That means Turkey. Germany was supported by Turkey. So, basically this First World War was between the Britishers and the Germans. So, if the war was between Britishers and Germans, then how this war affected India's independence? What role it played? See, let me tell you students that this First World War played a very important role in India's freedom. Now, students, see how India was related to the First World War, or how First World War created a sense of nationalism. See, the First World War was fought between the Britishers and the Germans, and the Britishers were ruling in India. So, that way, in indirect way, India was affected by the First World War. And you know, the First World War, it created a series. And you know, the First World War created a series of events, and because of this, the feeling of nationalism, the sense of nationalism came in our country. How? Because you know, there were several new economic and political situations that arose because of the First World War. Now we are going to see about the impacts of First World War on Indian national movement. That what were the impacts of this First World War? Even though we didn't participate directly, still it created a huge impact on the Indian national movement. So we will see the impact of India. So now we will see the impacts of First World War. Alright. So the first impact is increase in defense expenditure of British. See, if war will be there, then definitely weapons will be required, it will be needed. So in order to fulfill the need of weapons, what a country does? It increases taxes and war loans. So you know what? Custom duties were raised and income tax was introduced. Now who will pay these duties and taxes? The common people, the Indians, they will pay these duties and taxes. So because of First World War, the taxes and duties were increased for the Indians because they only had to pay to the Britishers. Alright. Next point is the price of essential commodities increased. You know students, in order to get money from Indians so that they could fight the war, they increased huge taxes and they also increased the price of essential commodities. For example, if I talk about salt, if I talk about the clothes, so price of these essential commodities were increased and all this the Indians had to bear. Alright. Now let us come to the third point. The third point is villagers. Now let us come to the next point. The next point is villagers were called upon to supply soldiers and the force recruitment in rural areas caused widespread anger within the people. Now what do you understand by force recruitment? That means people were forced to join the army. They were not interested. Why will they be interested? The war was not in India, it was between Britain, it was between the Britishers and the Germans. Then why Indians will go and fight the war for the Britishers? So since they needed people, they needed army, so force recruitment was there in our country. Alright, so this was also one important impact. Then we have crop failure. You know that time what happened? Because of crop failure, there was acute shortage of food. And not only that, there was outbreak of influenza epidemic. And you know students, according to 1921 census, 12 to 13 million people perished as a result of famine and epidemic. Perished means they died because of this adverse situation. So that time the situation was not at all normal. The situation was worse that time. People were facing food shortage. Then epidemic was also there, then the Britishers were also ruling us, they were forcing the people to get into the army. So these are important impacts of First World War on the Indian national movement. And then we will see that how all this led to the feeling of nationalhood and then how the movement was launched. Alright. Now, so please cut that line. So students, all these points, they created a fertile ground for the revolt because people were angry, because we were ultimately suffering. The war was between the Britishers and the Germans, but in that war, Indians were suffering. Why? Because Britishers were ruling in our country. They wanted men, they wanted money, so they were taking everything from our country and we were dominated by them. Instead, they should be thankful to our country, but they were not at all thankful, rather they were subjugating us. So all this created a stage, a fertile ground for the emergence of national movement. And because of all these points, because of all these impacts, what happened? National movements were launched. And you know, a new leader appeared and suggested a new mode of struggle, and that is Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. So, in the next video, I am going to explain you about the arrival of Mahatma Gandhi in our country, that when he arrived and after his arrival, what he did about his ideas of Satyagraha. So, students, I feel that till here points are clear to everybody. In the next video, I shall be proceeding with this chapter and I shall be explaining you about the idea of Satyagraha. Till then, thank you so much and stay safe.